В октябре 2018 года Сенат США принял резолюцию, посвященную 85-летию украинского голода 1932-33 годов, который, кстати, в США был признан как геноцид. Но почему в этой резолюции ничего не говорилось о голоде в Казахстане 30-х годов? И почему во многих странах мира либо вообще ничего не знают, либо мало слышали о миллионах погибших во время казахского шашлык? Хотя по количеству жертв и страшным последствиям голодомор в Казахстане ничем не уступает украинской трагедии. Эти, а также другие вопросы мы задали Саре Кэмерон, известному американскому исследователю, который в прошлом году публично призвал американский конгресс также помнить и говорить о казахском голоде, как о части советской истории. Кстати, в январе 2019 года в Вашингтоне в книжном магазине Politics and Prose Bookstore Сара Кэмерон представила свою новую книгу. Вот она, под названием The Hungry Steppe, Famine, Violence and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan, что в переводе значит «Голодная степь», «Голод, насилие и создание Советского Казахстана». Во время презентации была наша съемочная группа в лице Данияра Косназарова и Эрдена Дикибая. Я также хотел бы отдельно поблагодарить Айталкын Курманову из Джордж Вашингтон Университи за оказание поддержки в организации этой встречи. И вашему вниманию мы хотели бы представить интервью, сделанное с Сарой Кэмерон, но не только по поводу этой книги. Нам было интересно пообщаться с человеком, который взглянул на тему казахского голода со стороны, как иностранный ученый, который, как и мы, считает, что здесь не должно оставаться никаких белых пятен. И тем более не должно быть никаких попыток кастрировать историю, изменить или переписать ее в угоду любой идеологии, как это когда-то делалось при Советском Союзе. Давайте послушаем Сару Кэмерон и сделаем свои выводы сами.
About my book on the Kazakh famine of the 1930s, and I'd like to begin with sharing a memory by a survivor of the famine. I argue that the Kazakh famine of 1930 to 33 was the result of Moscow's radical attempt to transform the nomadic peoples of the steppe, who were known as Kazakhs, and a particular territory, Soviet Kazakhstan, into a modern Soviet nation. It finds that through the most violent means, the Kazakh famine created Soviet Kazakhstan, a stable territory with clearly delineated boundaries that was an integral part of the Soviet economic system. I also find that it created a new Kazakh national identity that largely supplanted Kazakhs' previous identification with the system of pastoral nomadism. In the famine's aftermath, Kazakhs began to think of themselves as a national group as opposed to a social group or one oriented around the system of pastoral nomadism. In many other respects, Moscow fails to achieve its goals. Ultimately, neither Kazakhstan nor Kazakhs themselves became integrated into the Soviet system in precisely the ways that Moscow had originally hoped. In fact, the scars from this famine would haunt the Republic through the remainder of the Soviet era and shape its transformation into independent nation in 1991. When the Kazakh famine is mentioned in the scholarly literature, it is often referred to as a miscalculation by Stalin, a tragedy, or a misunderstanding of cultures. But such depictions, I would argue, actually downplay the very violent nature of this disaster. There was nothing natural about it. Pastoral nomadism was not a backwards way of life, but rather a highly sophisticated and adaptive system. It's often assumed, for instance, that the Gulag represented the extreme of suffering in Soviet society. But actually, if we look at the course of the famine, starving Kazakhs are actually expelled from their land to make room for the construction of a forced labor camp. And they die from hunger while outside the gates of this camp while prisoners are laboring within. On the subject of Soviet modernization, though it had notable successes in important ways, this project of Soviet modernization falls desperately short of its goals in Kazakhstan. Collectivization is an economic catastrophe across the Soviet Union, but nowhere were its effects more disastrous than in Soviet Kazakhstan. Overall, I believe that the example of the Kazakh famine should cause us to look at the nature of Soviet modernization differently. Some scholars have argued that the Soviet Union carries out a striking leap in state capacity and mobilization during the interwar period, but the Kazakh case reveals that the contours of this leap were uneven, and they look very different in the Soviet Union's east than they do in the west. My interest in Kazakhstan and in the famine more generally started when I was in graduate school. So I was a graduate student in Soviet history at Yale University, so I knew Russian, and I began to take a couple of courses in the Middle East. We didn't have a Central Asia specialist, unfortunately, and that's fairly typical of most major universities, that they don't have a Central Asia specialist. But some of the themes from Middle East history then led me to Central Asia, and I really, began to be quite interested because I realized that very little had been written about Soviet Central Asia, and that it hadn't really been, that part of the Soviet Union hadn't been well incorporated into our understandings of Soviet history. And the closer I looked, I also realized that what little that had been written largely on the basis of Uzbekistan. And that had been the major focus of scholarly research. And so I thought, people often, American scholars would often generalize about Uzbekistan, use Uzbekistan as a way to generalize about Central Asia as a whole and say, oh, it was like this in Uzbekistan, thus the whole of Central Asia was this way. And of course, as anyone, from the region knows, that's not a fair generalization, that there are very real differences across the region. So I looked at Kazakhstan because very little research had been done, and also from a pragmatic standpoint, because I'm a historian and I go where there's good archival access. And Kazakhstan is actually quite open, comparatively speaking, to some of the other republics, in that both the state and the party archives are open. So I went to Kazakhstan for a summer to begin learning Kazakh, because it was really important to me to learn to learn Kazakh so I could try to capture both the central and the local story. And when I was there, I was still thinking of a topic, and I started flipping through elementary school textbooks, and that's when I came across the references to the famine. And I was so startled by that, because I thought, I have never, ever heard of this. And it is not even, in the overviews of the Soviet period that we have in the West that we think of as really good accounts, most of them don't even mention it. I had heard of the Ukrainian famine, I'd never heard of the Kazakh famine. So that's when I began to think, this I think would be a really interesting topic, and I began work on it. So that's how my interest in it started. Wrote that op-ed in part timed with an anniversary, because that's of course what makes things newsworthy, is that they have to be tied to a particular anniversary. And the U.S. Congress had just recognized, I believe it was the 85th anniversary of the Ukrainian famine, and that to me was really striking, that they recognized the anniversary of the Ukrainian famine and not the Kazakh famine. Of course we should recognize both, right? But like all things, this is connected to politics. It is connected to the fact that there's a large Ukrainian diaspora in the U.S. that then, in turns, lobbies representatives, and of course we don't have a large Kazakh diaspora in the United States. But more generally, I thought then I would use that anniversary to point out the ways that we have remembered the Ukrainian famine. There's been a memorial built to it. It was declared a genocide, right? We've had this congressional resolution commemorating it, but that the Kazakh famine has been basically totally neglected in our understanding of the Soviet period. And so I just kind of wanted to make that basic point, and to list a couple of the reasons why I think that we don't think about it, because I think the reasons that we don't think about it also illustrate broader points about how we construct our histories, right? And that histories and the history books that we have are not always representative of the past. I think it would be unlikely, in part because of the particular context in the way that the issue of the Ukrainian famine arose. So the Ukrainian famine was recognized as a genocide by the United States in the mid-1980s, and at the height of the Cold War, when really this was a big sticking point between the United States and the Soviet Union. And now, of course, the politics are different. And so I think because of that, it would be very difficult, and because of the fact that there's not a big Kazakh diaspora here, that it would be very difficult to push through a similar resolution about the Kazakh famine. I began to think a lot about this issue over the years when I was researching the book, because I was so struck by it, and I thought, there are probably there's a lot of deep-seated reasons for it. So on most basic level, one, we can say, I'm sure you'll bring this up in the documentary, right? The current Kazakh government has been reluctant to address the issue of the famine, and that means that it's less likely to be picked up in the West. I mean, if we look at the Ukrainian case, under certain governments, right, Ukraine has made the famine a central issue in terms of its national memory, and we really haven't seen quite the same in the Kazakh case. So that's, of course, one basic reason. But I think, on one level, I think is that Kazakhs, of course, during the time of the famine were nomads. And I think historically, if you look kind of globally, nomads are people who, by and large, they were an oral rather than a literary culture. They didn't tend to leave as many written records. And so there was less, I think, tangible evidence, perhaps, of people suffering and of what happened. And more generally, I would say people have often looked at, particularly the settled world, have looked at nomadic people through particular biases, right? They've said that they were backward, they've said that they were uncultured. And so, the Kazakh story is, I think, part of a larger global story about how the histories of nomadic peoples have been erased, and about how the violence committed against nomadic peoples have been erased. And I think we have evidence, actually, of this even in our own country. If you look at the United States, right, and you look at the ways that we are still coming to dealing with some of the terrible crimes that were committed against Native Americans. So I think that's one big reason, and you can actually even see this, I would argue, in the way the Kazakh famine is discussed in the scholarly literature. People will say, well, Moscow's, it was a miscalculation, what happened in Kazakhstan, or they use language that somehow implies that there was something kind of natural about this famine, that there was a human hand to it, but there was something kind of natural. So for instance, when they talk about the Ukrainian famine and the Kazakh famine in comparison to each other, scholars, for instance, they might refer to the Ukrainian famine as a terror famine, and they will refer to the Kazakh famine as a tragedy. Well, if you look at the roots of the word tragedy in its sort of classical sense, it was something that was actually kind of predetermined. And so I think if you look closely at the way the Kazakh famine has been talked about in the literature, I think you will find roots of this idea that, well, they were nomads and that there was something natural about nomads starving. I think that is one very kind of basic reason why it hasn't been discussed as much in the West. I think another basic reason is that if we look at the development of Soviet history as a field in the US, it's been very Eurocentric, and that we still have not, to a great extent, incorporated the Soviet East into our understandings of Soviet history. And I think the Kazakh famine is one example of that. There's probably other really big events. I mentioned the Aral Sea, right, that have also not been incorporated into our understanding of Soviet history. So, but I mean, so your question, just to remind myself, it's about why the Kazakh famine, and in comparison to the Ukrainian famine in particular. So I think, going back to that, I think there's also a way that so of course the debate over the Ukrainian famine has been very, very polemical, right? And there have been some of those who want to claim that the Ukrainian famine was directed against Ukrainians specifically as a national group, who try to claim famine as a uniquely Ukrainian event. And by that, I mean that they literally write whole books about the Ukrainian famine, which claimed to set it against a broader backdrop of what was going on in the Soviet Union as a whole, and they don't even mention the Kazakh case. Or they will say things like, well, that this was directed against Ukrainians, and yes, the Kazakh famine, but that went according to a completely different pattern. Do you see what I mean? They're separating it kind of out from the narrative, because I think a lot of the claims of some Ukrainian scholars that the famine was directed specifically against Ukrainians, they rest in part on the claim that the Ukrainian famine was uniquely brutal, that only these things were done in Ukraine. But if you look more broadly, that's simply not true. These same tactics were used against Kazakhs as well. And so I think there are many wonderful scholars of the Ukrainian famine, but some scholars of the Ukrainian famine, I think, are uncomfortable with the Kazakh case being brought more fully into the picture or compared in some way with the Ukrainian case, because they kind of want, as a scholar of the famine, Nicholas Wirth, put it, they want the monopoly on sorrow. I thought that was a really interesting way of putting it, but I think that is in part also why you don't hear about the Kazakh famine, is because almost in Americans' minds, Americans, I should say, don't know that much about collectivization. Many have never heard of the Ukrainian famine. But if they have heard of famine and collectivization, they've heard of the Ukrainian famine. So that is what they associate the period with. That is what it is. Collectivization, led to the slaughter of Ukrainians. They don't think about the Kazakh case. And so in some ways, the framing, the way some Ukrainians have framed the story has basically pushed the Kazakh case out of the picture. Well, the question of genocide is always a really difficult question. What I have found is an intent to destroy Kazakh culture. So I think if we look at older understandings of genocide, so was a scholar, a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who actually coined the term genocide, and then the Genocide Convention, which eventually came up with the legal definition, they hammered it into another meaning. The Genocide Convention, the legal definition, focuses very much on physical destruction, like killing. The Lemkin definition would include forms of cultural destruction. And so I think the Kazakh famine would fit the broader Lemkin definition if we look at cultural destruction. To my mind, the Kazakh famine is something that deserves our ultimate, moral condemnation in terms of what happened to Kazakhs. And so I think that should make us, relook and rethink at the field of, say, genocide studies, which only studies those, might only study those cases that fit the definition of genocide. Because here is a case that, was incredibly destructive to human life, and it also stemmed from a political process. So the reasons for the famine in Kazakhstan, of course, number one, we have to put collectivization at the top of the list. And collectivization was also accompanied by meat and grain procurements. And so the meat procurements obviously affected Kazakhs because Kazakhs at the time were pastoral nomads, and the basis of their livelihood was pasturing their animal herds. And right, when many of them are forced to give that up, then it affects their livelihood. Many Kazakhs also traded for grain, and so they were affected by procurements that were placed upon, say, Russian communities. They were also affected by grain procurements simply because they were asked to give up grain, but they didn't have any, so they had to sell their animals then in order to get grain, they had to sell their animals to get grain, which then they would use to meet the procurements. I think, however, if we take a longer view, we can also see that the legacies of Russian imperial rule, and by that I mean peasant settlement of the Kazakh steppe, are also important. I don't mean to say that a famine would have occurred without the Soviet regime's interventions. I think that's the most crucial thing. But Russian imperial settlement of the Kazakh steppe, it changed Kazakhs' diet, it changed their migration routes, and I think it made this sort of famine more likely. So I would say that that was a kind of a contributing factor. If we look more closely at the dynamics of the famine itself, I think there are also a couple other factors that come into play. One is there is a drought that occurs in 31. Now, I don't mean, some scholars of the famine have said either it was caused by politics or it's caused by the weather. I don't subscribe to those kind of binaries. What we can see is that the Soviets were very clearly warned about the fact that if you try to make parts of this area into an agrarian region, that you're going to have grain shortfalls, and people are going to suffer for that. They went ahead anyways, and so after collectivization had started in the summer of 31, there is a drought, a terrible drought. And because in Moscow's mind, right, the weather could never affect grain yields, they still imposed the same procurements on Kazakhs. So the weather affected and intensified the death toll, but this was a factor that was, the Soviets were clearly warned about this, right? It wasn't a surprise in some senses. The other factor that becomes important midway through is also that of disease. And so Kazakhs, in comparison, say, for instance, to Ukraine, as a society, they had less access to modern medical care. Vaccinations and these sorts of things hadn't been carried out. So disease becomes a factor in the Kazakh case in a way that it doesn't in the Ukrainian case. Well, the famine of the 1920s is under-researched. I really struggled to find a good account of it. And so I think I can give you probably a partial accounting of the differences, but we really need more research on the earlier famine. So one of the clear differences, it seems to me, is that the famine of the 1930s affected all of Kazakhstan, whereas the famine of the 1920s, we have really two distinct famines. There's one around, connected in part with Tashkent, and then there's one Tashkent, of course, was does not become part of Kazakhstan, but it affects that area that's close to Tashkent, that's part of the steppe. And then there's a famine in the north of Kazakhstan. I think part of it also, the reasons for it differ because I think rail access was cut off for part of the Civil War famine. This also contributes to some of the reasons for starvation. But in general, I think we need more research into the famine of the 20s. Thanks very much for this question, which is actually a very difficult question to answer. I think to fully answer this question, we need more accounts of collectivization in other Central Asian republics. We need also, on a broad level, we need comparison of weather patterns in these regions, because again, I'm not saying that weather caused this crisis, and I'm trying to stress the way that the weather was actually an anticipated factor. This is something the Soviet regime should not get off the hook for, right? They knew this was going to be a problem and they persisted anyway. But I think that would be helpful in trying to disaggregate why it was that Kazakhs suffered the most. I think, of course, one of the reasons why Kazakhs suffered the most is the fact that they were nomads. Of course, if you look at other parts of Central Asia, there are also other nomadic societies, particularly the Kyrgyz and the Turkmen. I think one reason might have to do with the fact that if we look at Central Asia during this period, Kazakhstan was not part of what they called the Central Asian Bureau. It was a different economic zone. The Central Asian Bureau, which included, the present-day states of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, was focused more on cotton production, whereas Kazakhstan was in a different economic zone, and it was focused more on meat and grain production. But again, I think it's a really important question, and it's one in some respects we don't have a good answer to. Maybe actually one more factor I would add in is that even once famine begins, Kazakhstan becomes a major region for sending deported peoples. And I think this also contributes to the death toll. So for instance, they build this huge forced labor camp, Karlag, in Kazakhstan. They send in lots of so-called special settlers. And the horrifying thing is that they send these people in even as they have reports that people are starving in Kazakhstan. So as you can imagine, this undoubtedly puts more pressure on the food supply. I have not found evidence to indicate that other Central Asian groups fled on the same scale that Kazakhs did. I mean, of course, part of the reason why Kazakhs fled is that they were nomads, and for nomads, flight is always a strategy that they've long, historically used to escape unfavorable political or economic conditions. So to a certain extent, we also see the Turkmen or the Kyrgyz also fleeing when collectivization starts. But famine was just much, much more severe in Kazakhstan. So I think that's why we see the scale of the Kazakh flight reaching the heights that it does. It's a very interesting question, and I think one that we need more research on. I've always, wherever I go, I stress that someone should do a study on how the famine has been remembered in Kazakhstan, because I discussed this a little bit in the epilogue to my book, but I can only touch the surface. It's a whole separate question in and of itself. We also need more studies by people in different disciplines. So for instance, famine scholars, epidemiologists have demonstrated in various ways that actually the effects of the famine can be intergenerational. So for instance, if your ancestor starved or experienced malnutrition during the famine, that could be passed on to the children or even grandchildren in some way. I know actually of an epidemiologist who was interested in working, an American epidemiologist who contacted me. He was really interested in doing such a study in Kazakhstan, but he can't find local partners. And he feels that perhaps the Ministry of Health in Kazakhstan is not ready to work on this topic. So for instance, that sort of study hasn't been done, right? The long-term tracing site, the long-term health effects of famine, how it might have, clearly, of course, it had an effect on births, right? Lost births, but I'm sure it probably also had long-term health effects. I think in many respects we can see Kazakhstan as kind of a post-traumatic society. So I was really honored and very overcome and overwhelmed by all the many people who wrote to me after my op-ed came out. People sharing stories of what they had experienced, what their families had experienced, stories that had been passed down in the generations. And I was really, really, moved by this, very struck by this. And it seems to me that there should be some more public way for them to collect these stories and to share them. Sure. I think it would be great to have more public discussion and awareness of the famine in Kazakhstan. Well, I think there's a lot of important work to be done on the Kazakh case. As I point out in my book, one of the striking things to me in terms of researching the Kazakh famine is that we don't even actually have a good account of the Kazakh death toll. It's just so striking to me that, for instance, in the Ukrainian case, they've done all of this work to actually, to trace it down to the district, to the rayon level. That hasn't been done in the Kazakh case. So we don't even, we can make educated guesses as to, okay, well, here famine was probably the most severe, but until we have that demographic data, it becomes really difficult to actually trace some of the famine's causal factors. Because so to go back to the Ukrainian case, when they did this work, they realized that some of their existing explanations for the famine were wrong. in terms of the causal factors. And that demographic data then caused them to look again at the specific reasons for the famine. So I think, well, first, on a basic level, I hope that some scholars in Kazakhstan might take up, many of the points or areas of that where we still don't understand the Kazakh famine very well, and the death toll is one big example of that. I think another area which I would love to see more research on is the human side of the famine. This is something that I became very interested in when I was doing my research, because I found that Soviet bureaucratic documents didn't convey the human side of the story. Many of them were not written by Kazakhs themselves. So I think it would be really interesting to have a kind of to collect some of the stories that have been passed down through families, even if there are any survivors remaining, to continue interviewing them. I know some of these a few of these sorts of projects have been done, but I think it needs to be done on a wider scale. So I think those would be some of the suggestions I would offer.
Thank you very much.
Sure.